Our first company is focused on high-purity manganese and the Butcherberg Manganese Project just south of Newman. Please welcome the Executive Director of Montezuma Mining Company, Justin Brown. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm here to present our story, which has just gone through a historic sort of change in that we've changed our name from Montezuma Mining Company to Element 25. That affected last Friday. The ASX ticker will change from MZM to E25 tomorrow. We're advised by the ASX. The change is a reflection of our focus on high-purity manganese. Manganese is number 25 on the periodic table, hence the name, and that's the theme of what I want to talk about today. So basically, we see ourselves as having crossed the threshold of being a diversified explorer to a developer, and that's by virtue of the manganese project that we've discovered, drilled out, and taken through to a scoping study stage, which was published last week. The snapshot of the company is that we've got about 83 million shares on issue, a balance sheet comprising $10 million roughly in cash and liquid listed investments, and an EV of about 10 million. So for a new development story, we're pretty undervalued against our peers, and I think that'll probably change. Hopefully you agree as we walk through the presentation. The board is a fairly conventional exploration type board with myself as a geologist, Seamus Cornelius as chairman, who's a lawyer, and John Ribbons as an accountant. You can probably expect that to evolve as we move closer to production at this world-class manganese project at Butcherberg. I'm going to talk about high-purity manganese a little bit. It's a space that nobody really knows anything about, is my experience, because there's no one doing it apart from us and one or two others, mostly at the exploration stage, one European company at the early sort of development stage, and then the rest of the industry is in China. And so you probably don't have the CRUs of the world sort of motivated to look into it too deeply, but it's a pretty interesting segment in that manganese sort of conventionally is thought of as a steel input, and indeed 90% of the manganese produced globally goes into steel. However, the 10% that goes into the high purity segment is worth 40% of the global market. So you get a massive value uplift as you step up the purity scale, and that's the bit that attracts us. It goes into manganese metal, it goes into electrolytic manganese dioxide, which is a battery input, and it goes into manganese sulfate, which is also used for batteries, particularly the next generation NMC batteries, as well as the LMOs and some of the more cutting edge ones as well. So it is a battery metal, apart from being an input that's used in other industries as well. Manganese sulfate goes into fertiliser. It's an important trace nutrient that is needed for certain soil types and animal nutrients, feeds. So it's a big it's an education exercise for us. You guys are probably hearing about high purity manganese the first time today for most of you. But we had some work commissioned by Metal Bulletin, and they see a pretty robust market going forward, both on the demand side and the price side. Interestingly, that's probably driven as well by the fact that the manganese ore sort of industry in China's kind of on its knees. They've sort of largely depleted their ores domestically, and they need to go to Africa to source the manganese units they need to produce these products. And so there's a really interesting opportunity for new projects to come into this market, and that's what Element 25 is intending to do from our Butcherberg project. It's a genuine world-class resource. It's 180 million tonnes in JORC Resources, located in Western Australia, 100% owned by Element 25, and it's at scoping study stage, and pre-feasibility studies have commenced, and will sort of roll out in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. The resource looks like that. It's 180 million tonnes, mostly the inferred category, with about 22 million tonnes drilled out to the indicated category, which was the basis for the scoping study work. It's a relatively low-grade deposit in ground. However, it beneficiates very easily to about a 30–33% concentrate, just through scrubbing out the fines. So it's geologically fairly unique, and that's one of the attributes that have given us this opportunity in the high purity manganese space, because it behaves a little bit differently to most other manganese ores when you get into the hydrometallurgical process. It has a couple of other interesting attributes, one being the Goldfields gas pipeline transects the project, as does the Great Northern Highway. So we've got a kind of an instant logistics solution, and we've got a kind of instant energy solution, which is important because high purity manganese, particularly for manganese metal, requires a lot of energy. So those two things allow the project to take a big leap forward in terms of development. Geologically, it's about as simple as these things get. It's got a life of mine strip ratio of 0.2 to 1, so you're really just mining the ore body. You're not worrying about waste too much. It's incredibly boring from a geological point of view. It's very homogeneous, and basically the technical risk from a mining perspective is kind of next to zero. It outcrops. You trip over it as you walk along it. You can start mining ore from day one, and it just doesn't raise any red flags at all. The key to all this was a breakthrough that we made in 2017. At the start of 2017, we were approached by the federal government Innovations Connection program. They said that they had some grant funding to provide to innovative new processing sort of concepts. We partnered up with CSIRO, and CSIRO spent the best part of 2017 having a look at the ore body and seeing what we could do to take it to a higher value product. One of the challenges of where we are is the logistics side of things, so the more value we could add on site, the less of an issue that was. And through a series of sort of trial and error steps, they discovered that using a certain chemical flow sheet, our ore leaches amazingly well. The test on this particular flow sheet extracted 95% of the manganese at about 30 minutes at the lab scale, which is phenomenally fast leach kinetics, and is not something that anyone else can do as far as we know. They then spent the second half of 2017 doing the purification process work. Again, that quite simply allowed us to produce a very high purity pregnant leach solution, which can be used to produce all of those three products I talked about earlier: manganese metal, manganese dioxide and manganese sulfate. So that kind of inspired us, I guess, to have a look at the high-level economics, which was the focus of the scoping study that took place at the start of this year. But just, I guess, drilling in on that flow sheet a little bit, one of the key differentials for us is that, as against our competitors who have to either leach carbonate ores from China with sulfuric acid, or do what's called a roast reduction process, where they have to heat the oxide ores to 1,000 degrees Celsius to reduce the manganese to allow it to leach. The butcherbird ores leach incredibly fast at ambient temperatures and atmospheric pressures. In fact, the reaction's exothermic, so we also produce energy. We don't need to put any in. And to just produce the manganese sulfate product, our process flow sheet's actually energy neutral, which is quite remarkable. At the back end, if you're going to produce metal, you do have to put a lot of energy in to plate the metal through an electrolytic process. And the power solution for this project is obviously also a key piece of work for us. But because we've got the gas pipeline, we've got a big leap ahead of most competitors. So the scoping study gave us pretty robust numbers, and we're inspired to go to the next level. So we've initiated a PFS, which will roll out over the next 12 to 18 months. The key factors that we see being critical to this project is the scale. Having 180 million tonnes is an interesting issue to have, in that typically you want to optimise your resource over 7 to 10 years. In fact, if we build a business that produces 100,000 tonnes of manganese metal, for example, we'll generate sort of north of $200 million US in sales, but we'll have a 180-year mine life. So we've got to find the sweet spot between the capital hurdle at the start and optimising that resource. The power is going to be really critical, because if you've got to put an electrolytic winning plant in, you need 6,000 kilowatt hours per tonne of manganese metal that you want to produce. So your unit cost of electricity becomes quite an important sensitivity. Having the gas pipeline there gives us very clear visibility on about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. But we're talking to some specialists in the field that believe that with up to 70% integration of renewable energy and load balancing and other clever sort of techniques, we can drive that with scale down potentially in the medium term as low as 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which will be quite remarkable if we can do that. And if we can do that, we basically kill the pig in terms of our operating costs. We have a pretty clear logistics solution through Fremantle, which is a 1,050-kilometre haul south of the project. But at the Port Hedland port, there's actually an approved, permitted container port which is waiting for a foundation customer. So we see a good opportunity to talk with them and potentially be that foundation customer, and then cut our logistics costs in half over what the scoping studies has described. Mining is not an issue for us. As I've said to you, the ore body is incredibly simple. Marketing is a key sensitivity. We need to establish offtake. The battery sector is a new and growing market which is really dependent on spec, so you've got to partner up with these offtakers and guarantee them and show them that you can actually produce the spec that they need on a reliable basis, and that's a key part of the PFS. Piloting will allow us to produce samples for offtake discussions. Manganese metal you can sell effectively on a spot market, so it's not as big an issue. But manganese dioxide is a bit like sulphate in that you need to show that it has the right electrical behaviour to make the batteries perform. So there'll be a lot of work put into the marketing. There's about 400,000 tonnes of high purity manganese outside China, so we don't need to go into China and compete directly with them in the early phases of the project. We can talk to a lot of guys outside China who have sort of made it pretty clear to us that they would love to see supply out of China. Currently the high purity manganese market is dominated by China. It's about 97% produced in China, but as I said to you, the ore market in China is kind of dead in the water, so there's a really interesting opportunity for us to displace market share or take share in the growing market in these products. So that's the vision for the next couple of years. We see a timeline of about 18 months to complete the PFS and DFS. We've got a budget of approximately $8 million on that process, which can be funded from existing cash and investments. We would potentially look at doing a small capital raising with a strategic coming on board if the right party presented itself and showed interest in the project. But we can take it out all the way ourselves if that's the way it plays out. We've got a notional 12-month build on the back end of that. If you drill into the budget a little bit, that's you can see that the network is probably the key item on that list. We need to go and do a test pit, get some sample, get a steady state pilot plant going to produce, well, demonstrate the robustness of the process in a real world situation, but also to produce product for off-takers to look at and examine and enter into discussions on. We need to drill out a maiden reserve, and that's a decent chunk of it, and the rest of that's sort of your general permitting, environmentals, native title and things. So that's about $5.5 million. There's another couple of million on top of that for the DFS. So I guess in conclusion, really the key points that I'd say to you as a potential investor is that we have a world-class resource. That's unquestioned in my view. We've got a technology breakthrough which applies uniquely to that resource. We don't believe that others can use that process, so we think that this ambient temperature, atmospheric pressure process can be a real disruptor in the way high purity manganese is currently produced, and we aim to be the company that takes that into production. Really simple geology, which is not something everyone can say. We think the technical risk on the geology side is at the low end by a fair stretch. There's a sweet spot in the market with demand increases forecast going forward for these products. We have a unique opportunity to fill that demand at a time when the Chinese industry is probably struggling, to be fair. We've got a number of competitive advantages over current producers with the atmospheric pressure and ambient temperature nature of it, the really cheap cost of ore. I mean, a Chinese producer needs to buy ore from South Africa. We don't have to do that. We can mine ours for a very small cost, given the simple nature of the deposit. The scoping study's given us a pretty good heads up on what the economics are, and they look good. And with a strong balance sheet, we don't need to go cap in hand to investors to raise capital. We can be deal makers as opposed to deal takers on that front, and we can try and get the right strategics on board at the right time. As far as I know, we're the only ASX listed company that's doing this, and in fact the number of companies that are having a look at this space can be probably numbered on one hand. So I think as an investor, if you want exposure, you've got a pretty limited list of players that you can invest in, Montezuma, I think, being the leading one. So have a closer look, and I'm happy to take any questions, or we've got a booth out there, and if you want to know more, feel free to come and see me, but thanks for listening.